In this explosive encounter, two heavyweights of the entertainment world clash on Bill Maher's late-night show. Harrison Ford, known for his sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude, finds himself at odds with Bill Maher in a fiery debate that escalates beyond control. Tensions boil over, and in a shocking turn of events, Harrison Ford is ejected from the show mid-interview. What led to this explosive confrontation, and who emerged victorious? Make sure to like and subscribe to find out what happens when two powerful personalities collide. The atmosphere on the set of Real Time with Bill Maher had always been electric, but tonight, it felt like the air itself was crackling with anticipation. The audience was buzzing, waiting for the next guest to take the stage. It wasn't just any guest. Harrison Ford, the legendary actor with decades of iconic roles under his belt, was about to sit down for a conversation with Bill Maher. The interview promised to be a clash of titans, but no one could have predicted just how explosive it would become. As Harrison Ford walked onto the stage, his usual cool demeanor commanded the room. He gave a brief nod to Bill, who was grinning from ear to ear, ready to poke fun at the actor's famously no-nonsense attitude. Ford's reputation as a man of few words but intense conviction preceded him, and Bill knew he had to bring his A-game to get the actor to open up. But Bill Maher wasn't about to hold back. His sharp tongue was poised for a sharp-edged conversation. "Great to have you on the show, Harrison," Bill began, his voice smooth but tinged with sarcasm as if testing the waters for the confrontation he was sure would follow. "Now, we all know you as Han Solo and Indiana Jones, but let's talk about you as, well, Harrison Ford the man. You've always been a bit of a rebel, haven't you?" Ford smirked, a glint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "I suppose I've never been one to follow the herd," he replied. His tone was measured, but there was an underlying sharpness, a warning that this conversation wasn't going to be as easy as Bill might have hoped. "Right," Bill said, leaning forward, sensing an opening. "You've spent your career playing these larger-than-life characters who defy authority, challenge systems, and fight for what's right. But tell me, Harrison, what do you really think about the world today? Do you think people are still capable of fighting for the right thing? Or are we all just too distracted by the noise of politics, social media, and, well, you know, everything that's going on?" It was a question that had been lingering in the air for some time, one that Bill Maher loved to throw at his guests, an invitation for them to share their thoughts on the chaotic political landscape. But it wasn't just a casual question. Bill's eyes narrowed as he spoke, his voice dripping with skepticism. He wasn't just asking Ford for a thought-provoking answer. He was challenging him to take a stance. He wanted a response that would play into his narrative, a response that would provide fodder for his usual political commentary. Harrison Ford, however, wasn't the kind of man to be baited so easily. He shifted in his seat slightly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Bill's. For a moment, the two men sized each other up, the weight of their words hanging between them. It was clear that Ford was more than capable of handling Bill's sharp rhetoric, but what came next was anything but expected. "You're framing this as if the world is somehow more complicated now than it's ever been," Ford began, his voice steady but with an edge to it. "But let's be real, Bill. The world has always been complicated. The systems we live in, the politics, the structures that hold us back, they've always been in place. The only difference now is that people are starting to wake up to that fact." Bill raised an eyebrow. "So you think the system's broken? You're one of those burn-it-all-down people, huh?" he asked, his tone half mocking, half curious. Ford didn't flinch. "No, I don't think we should burn it all down, but I do think we need to stop pretending that the system is working for the people. It's not." His voice was low, but there was an undeniable intensity behind it. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Bill, clearly taken aback by the forcefulness of Ford's response, leaned back in his chair, the smirk fading from his face. This was not the conversation he had expected. He had prepared for the usual banter, the jokes, maybe a couple of zingers about Ford's past roles. But instead, Ford was giving him an impassioned stance that seemed to challenge everything Bill had built his career on, the notion that the system could be fixed, that things could improve with a little tweaking. "So, what's your solution, Harrison?" Bill asked, his voice tinged with skepticism but also curiosity. "What do we do about it?" Ford leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Bill's. "Start by being honest about it. Acknowledge that the system is stacked against people who don't have the power to change it. You can't fix something if you're pretending it's not broken." The tension was palpable. The audience could feel it too, their anticipation building. What had begun as a typical late-night exchange was turning into a battle of ideologies, a clash between two very different worldviews. And just when it seemed like things might calm down, Bill Maher delivered the next blow. "Yeah, but isn't that a little idealistic?" Bill retorted, his voice sharp. "We can't just tear everything down and start over. That's how you get chaos. Look at history." Ford's response was swift. "Maybe chaos is the only way forward." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as though they were challenging Bill and everyone watching to reconsider their assumptions about what it meant to change the world. The stage was set. The conversation was no longer just about politics or current events. It was a battle of ideas, of convictions, and neither side was willing to back down. The atmosphere on set had shifted dramatically. What started as an insightful conversation had turned into a full-fledged ideological battle. The audience, who had been waiting for the usual jokes and light-hearted banter, was now on the edge of their seats, riveted by the tension unfolding between Bill Maher and Harrison Ford. The two men, once jovial and engaging, now sat like two gladiators in a modern-day arena, each with his own sword of sharp words, each determined to come out victorious. Bill Maher, never one to shy away from a fight, took a moment to gather his thoughts. He wasn't about to let Ford's blunt honesty get the best of him. After all, he was a seasoned veteran of political commentary, a master of twisting words and exposing the hypocrisy of his guests. But Harrison Ford was no ordinary guest. The actor had been around long enough to know how to handle himself in a heated exchange, and Bill's usual tricks weren't going to work on him. "So you're really suggesting we just tear it all down and rebuild from scratch?" Bill asked, his voice slightly strained but still carrying that confident edge. "Do you really think that's the solution? Because I've got news for you, Harrison. People like you, people like me, hell, we're the ones who have the privilege to even think about these things. But for the rest of the world? It's not that simple." Ford's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "I'm not suggesting we tear everything down blindly, Bill. I'm saying we need a complete re-evaluation of the system. It's not about revolution. It's about evolution. It's about progress. And that means recognizing the things that don't work and having the courage to fix them. Whether that's politics, corporate influence, or social inequality. But most importantly, it's about being honest with ourselves about the state of things." The words hung in the air, and the studio audience was silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Ford's voice, calm and collected, was a stark contrast to the biting tone Bill had taken. It was almost as if Ford was the one in control now. But Bill Maher wasn't about to let his guest dictate the terms of the conversation. He had a point to make, and he wasn't backing down. "You're talking about progress, but do you really think people are ready for it?" Bill shot back, his voice rising in intensity. "I mean, look at the world around us. We've got polarization at an all-time high. People who don't trust the government don't trust each other. We're not exactly in a position to start making sweeping changes, are we?" Ford didn't hesitate. "You're not wrong about the polarization, but the problem isn't just that people don't trust the government. It's that the government, the system, has lost the trust of the people. When you have a system that works for the wealthy and leaves the rest of us to fend for ourselves, what do you expect? People aren't angry because they want to tear everything down. They're angry because they've been ignored for too long. Bill's face twisted into a half-smirk, the kind of expression that told the audience he was about to deliver a sharp rebuttal. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he looked directly at Ford. "You talk about ignoring people, Harrison, but aren't you just as guilty as anyone? You've been part of the Hollywood elite for decades, living in your mansion with all the perks. You've got power, influence, access. You've been part of the system for your entire career. How does that make you any different from the people you're criticizing?" The words were like a punch to the gut. The audience collectively gasped, and for a brief moment the tension in the air felt suffocating. Harrison Ford, however, didn't flinch. He met Bill's gaze with unwavering resolve. "That's a cheap shot, Bill," Ford replied, his voice low but steady. "I don't deny the privileges I've had in my life, but I've also seen the cracks in the system up close. I've been on the outside looking in more times than you can count. I've fought to keep my voice and my principles intact in an industry that thrives on exploitation. Don't pretend like I don't understand what's at stake here." The crowd, which had been on the edge of their seats, seemed to exhale in unison. Bill Maher, visibly rattled by Ford's words, took a moment to regain his composure. He wasn't used to being put on the defensive, especially not by someone who had so easily turned the conversation around. For a moment he seemed almost lost for words, something rare for a man who prided himself on his sharp wit and quick comebacks. But Bill wasn't about to give up. He had his own narrative to push, and if Ford wasn't going to play by his rules, he'd find another way to get his point across. "Look, Harrison," Bill began, his tone now more serious, "I get it. You want to be the voice of reason, the one calling for change. But you can't ignore the fact that change, real change, comes at a cost. And right now, people aren't willing to pay that price. People want their comforts. They want their distractions. And as long as they have that, they're not going to want to hear about sweeping reforms." Ford leaned forward slightly, his eyes piercing. "Then maybe it's time for the comforts to be stripped away. Maybe it's time for people to stop hiding from the truth." The words landed with a heavy thud. There was no turning back now. The gloves were off, and neither Bill Maher nor Harrison Ford were willing to back down. What had started as a debate about politics and society had turned into something much deeper, something personal. Bill was visibly rattled, but he wasn't, about to let Ford have the final word. But Ford wasn't finished yet. "You asked if people are ready for change, Bill," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "Maybe the real question is, are you ready for it?" The tension in the room was palpable. Harrison Ford had laid his cards on the table, and Bill Maher was left reeling from the weight of the actor's words. The audience, which had been quiet for what felt like an eternity, began to murmur. There was a sense of disbelief, as if they were witnessing something far bigger than the usual political banter that had come to define Bill's show. This wasn't just a discussion. It was a clash of ideologies, of perspectives, of worldviews. Bill Maher, a man who had made his name through humor, wit, and his unflinching ability to challenge his guests, now found himself in an unfamiliar position. He was no longer in control. The scales had tipped, and Ford, with his calm demeanor and unwavering conviction, had the upper hand. But Bill wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. He straightened up, took a deep breath, and then delivered a sharp, almost sardonic laugh. "Oh, so now it's my fault the world isn't changing, huh?" Bill said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're really going to sit here and tell me that people like me are standing in the way of progress? Let me tell you something, Harrison. People like me have been fighting for change my whole life. But you're right about one thing. People aren't ready for it. They like their comfort too much." Ford's expression remained unchanged, his gaze unflinching. "Comfort doesn't change anything, Bill. It just prolongs the inevitable. People are ready for change. They're just waiting for someone with the courage to lead them there." The words hung in the air, and Bill couldn't help but feel the sting. There it was, the accusation that had been brewing throughout the entire conversation. Was he too comfortable? Was his career, his success, his lifestyle clouding his ability to truly see the bigger picture? He had spent years mocking politicians, pointing fingers at those in power, but now, in the face of Harrison Ford's unyielding challenge, Bill was forced to confront his own role in the very system he claimed to despise. Bill shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. "You think it's that easy, don't you? That people just need someone to point them in the right direction, and then everything will magically fall into place? That's not how the world works. Change takes time. It takes compromise. It takes—" Ford interrupted him, his voice steady and firm. "It takes people willing to risk it all, Bill. It takes people willing to stand up and say, 'Enough is enough.' You talk about compromise like it's a virtue, but all it does is water down the message. Sometimes you need to be uncompromising. Sometimes you need to look the system in the eye and say, 'You're broken and I'm going to fix it.'" Bill's eyes narrowed. The challenge was clear. Ford wasn't just debating politics. He was questioning Bill's very approach to life and work. The actor's words weren't merely ideological. They were personal. Bill had spent years crafting his persona as a no-nonsense truth-teller, but now, facing someone who was just as confident and far more passionate, he found himself questioning the very foundation of his beliefs. The audience, sensing the shift in dynamic, leaned in, captivated by the raw intensity of the exchange. It was clear this wasn't just a normal episode of Real Time with Bill Maher. This was a showdown, one that could change the tone of political discourse forever. Bill, ever the strategist, wasn't about to let Harrison Ford get the last word. "You're talking about standing up for what's right, Harrison," he said, his voice low but dangerous. "But what happens when you do that? What happens when you actually take a stand and challenge the system? You think they'll just let you walk away unscathed? No, Harrison. People who try to change things like you're suggesting end up getting crushed. The system fights back. It always does." Ford's eyes flashed with determination. "Let it. Fight back," he said, his voice rising with intensity. "Let it try. I'm not afraid of the fight. Are you?" For the first time in the conversation, Bill Maher's expression wavered. It was subtle, a brief flicker of uncertainty, but it was enough. Harrison Ford wasn't just challenging Bill's views on politics. He was challenging his courage, his willingness to stand up for something bigger than himself. And that was a challenge Bill couldn't ignore. The studio audience, still caught in the tension of the moment, waited for Bill's response. The clock was ticking. If Bill Maher didn't respond soon, this conversation could slip beyond his control entirely. Harrison Ford, with his quiet resolve, had managed to push Bill into a corner, forcing him to confront the very thing he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Bill took a deep breath, his fingers drumming on the table as he tried to regain his composure. He was the king of confrontations, the master of cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of the issue. But Harrison Ford had managed to do something Bill had never expected. He had made him doubt himself. "You're right about one thing, Harrison," Bill said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "Maybe we do need more people willing to take a stand. But I still think you're wrong about how easy it is to make change. It's not as simple as you make it sound." Ford met his gaze without hesitation. "Maybe it's not easy, Bill, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying." With that, Ford leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute. The fight was over, for now. But the battle had left its mark. The words that had been exchanged, the ideas that had been laid bare, were not easily forgotten. The tension between Harrison Ford and Bill Maher wasn't just palpable. It had become the very heartbeat of the room. The audience was riveted, their eyes locked on the two men at the table, waiting for the next move. Bill Maher, though known for his sharp wit and cutting commentary, now found himself on the back foot. his usual confidence shaken by the weight of Harrison Ford's words. This wasn't just a battle of political ideologies. It was an ideological earthquake, one that threatened to reshape the very foundation of Bill's show. Bill cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the narrative. "You know, Harrison," he began, his voice steady but edged with an underlying frustration. "You talk about taking a stand, but what does that really mean? What does it accomplish? You say people need to risk it all. Well, let me tell you something. Risking it all doesn't always lead to progress. Sometimes it just leads to destruction." Ford's eyes locked with Bill's, his gaze unwavering. "Destruction can be necessary, Bill. Sometimes you have to tear things down in order to rebuild them. This system, this country, it's not perfect, it's broken in so many ways. If we don't challenge it, if we don't force it to evolve, we're complicit in its failure." "What's your excuse for standing by while it crumbles?" The question hit Bill harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to process Ford's words. The studio was silent, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for Bill to respond. He'd always been the one in control, the one throwing the tough questions, but now, for the first time in a long while, Bill Maher was on the defensive. "Look, Harrison," Bill said after a long pause, his voice quieter, almost contemplative. "I get it, I really do. You're passionate, and you believe in your cause. But the reality is that not everyone shares your vision. Not everyone is ready for the kind of change you're talking about. You can't just demand that people wake up. People move at their own pace. It's not that simple." Ford's expression didn't change. "That's where you're wrong, Bill. It is that simple. People are ready. They just need to be led. You talk about change as if it's some impossible ideal, but it's not. Change happens when people are pushed, when they're shown a different way, when we stop waiting for permission and start taking action." Bill's face darkened, the frustration building inside him. "So now you're telling me how to do my job, how to do everyone's job? You think it's that easy? You think the world is just going to follow you because you've got a big name and a movie career behind you? It doesn't work that way. This isn't a Hollywood script, Harrison. It's real life." Ford didn't flinch. "No, it's not a Hollywood script. It's real life, and that's exactly why people like me need to speak up. Because the status quo isn't going to change itself, and it's sure as hell not going to change because people keep playing it safe, trying to please everyone. At some point, you've got to take a stand." The room was charged with the electricity of the exchange. It felt as though the air itself was thickening with every word, with every challenge that passed between the two men. The audience, who had once been hanging on Bill's every word, now seemed to be shifting in their seats, uncertain where their loyalties should lie. Bill Maher, the man who had built his career on confronting others, was now facing the unrelenting gaze of Harrison Ford, an actor who had long been known for his role as a hero, a leader, and now, for many, a symbol of defiance. But Bill wasn't one to back down, especially not on his own show. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "So, what are you saying, Harrison? That I'm part of the problem? That I'm standing in the way of progress?" Ford didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said simply. "Not because you're evil or malicious, Bill, but because you're too comfortable. You're too afraid to ruffle feathers, to disrupt the system. And people like that, people who stand by and make excuses, they're the ones who are enabling the status quo." The words stung, and Bill knew they weren't just directed at him. They were a challenge to everyone in the room, to every viewer, at home. Ford wasn't just attacking Bill's beliefs. He was attacking the very idea of complacency. He was saying that those who remained passive, those who refused to take risks and stand up for what they believed in, were as much a part of the problem as the very people they criticized. For a brief moment, the studio fell completely silent. Bill Maher was processing what had just been said, trying to digest the full weight of Ford's challenge. His usual quick-witted comebacks were nowhere to be found. In the face of Harrison Ford's impassioned speech, Bill Maher was vulnerable, something that had rarely, if ever, happened on real time with Bill Maher. Finally, Bill exhaled slowly, his posture shifting as he leaned back in his chair, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You really think it's that simple, don't you, Harrison?" he asked, his voice almost tired, as if the conversation had taken its toll. "You think people like me are just sitting around doing nothing? You're wrong." Ford didn't back down. "I'm not saying you're doing nothing, Bill. I'm saying you're not doing enough." The conversation had reached its boiling point. The conflict that had been brewing for so long was finally coming to a head. Both men had thrown down their respective gauntlets, challenging one another on a scale neither had anticipated. The question remained: who would come out on top? The atmosphere in the studio was thick with tension, a mixture of unease and anticipation hanging heavy in the air. The back and forth between Bill Maher and Harrison Ford had escalated into a full-blown confrontation, with both men unwilling to back down. For the first time in his career, Bill found himself truly challenged. His beliefs, his values, and his entire approach to change were under intense scrutiny. The question loomed large in the air. Who was right, the audience, who had watched in stunned silence throughout the fiery exchange, was now on the edge of their seats, waiting for the resolution. No one knew how this would end, but one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be a typical real-time episode. Something had shifted. Something had broken through the usual banter and jokes. The show had become something deeper, something more personal. Bill sat back in his chair, the weight of Ford's words still pressing down on him. He was the host, the man in control, the one who steered the conversation. But now, for the first time, he felt like the one being interrogated, the one who was on trial. His usual quick-witted comebacks seemed meaningless in the face of Ford's unyielding challenge. And yet, Bill Maher wasn't one to give up. He never had been. "All right, Harrison," Bill said, his voice firm but tinged with a sense of finality. "You want me to take a stand? Fine, I'll take one. But here's the thing. I don't think you're seeing the full picture. You're right about one thing. Change doesn't happen without risk. But you're wrong if you think it happens just by demanding it. You need strategy. You need patience. You need compromise. And you sure as hell need to understand that not everyone is as ready for that fight as you are." Ford leaned in, his expression softening slightly, but his voice unwavering. "Bill, you keep talking about strategy and patience, but sometimes that's just code for inaction. People who wait for the right moment never do anything. If you want change, you can't wait for it to come to you. You have to make it happen. If you're waiting for everyone to be ready, you'll wait forever." Bill shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface once again. "You make it sound so simple, like all it takes is some grand gesture and suddenly everything's fixed. But real life isn't a movie, Harrison. You can't just ride in on a horse and save the day. It doesn't work like that. If you want real change, it's going to take more than just your voice. It takes a movement. It takes time." Ford's gaze never wavered. "Bill, sometimes all a movement needs is one person to start it. One voice. One stand. And if everyone waited around for the perfect moment, nothing would ever get done. If you're serious about change, you have to risk everything for it. You have to make a stand, even when the world isn't ready." For a moment, Bill was quiet. His fingers drummed against the table once again, his mind racing as he processed Ford's words. This wasn't just about politics anymore. This wasn't just about opinions on the state of the world. This was about something deeper, a battle of principles, of what each man stood for. Harrison Ford had laid it all out on the table, daring Bill to take a stand, daring him to live up to the challenge of true change. But Bill Maher wasn't one to go down without a fight. He took a deep breath, then looked directly at Ford. "All right," he said, his voice calm but resolute. You've made your point. Maybe I'm too comfortable. Maybe I'm too cautious. But here's the thing, Harrison. What you're asking for isn't simple. It's not just about being bold. It's about making sure the bold actions are the right ones. And that takes more than just passion. It takes judgment. Ford's eyes softened, as if he understood the weight of what Bill was saying. I get it, Bill. I really do. But I think we're too quick to shy away from the hard choices. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the safe thing to do. Sometimes you have to step into the unknown, even when it's terrifying. Bill nodded slowly, taking a moment to reflect. The tension in the room seemed to ease, as if, for the first time, both men were starting to understand one another. Not completely, perhaps, but enough to recognize that they both wanted the same thing. Change. The path they saw to that change might differ, but the end goal was shared. With a final deep breath, Bill turned to face the audience, the fiery exchange finally winding down. Well, folks, he said, his usual smirk returning. I guess you've all seen what happens when two strong opinions collide. It's not always pretty, but that's what makes it interesting. And in the end, maybe that's what change is all about. Two sides coming together and challenging each other to think differently. Harrison Ford, for his part, gave Bill a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that, despite their differences, there had been a level of respect built through the exchange. No punches had been thrown, but the ideological battle had been just as intense. As the camera panned out and the credits began to roll, it was clear this would be an episode remembered for years to come. Not just because of the intensity of the conversation, but because of the deeper questions it raised. What does it mean to fight for change? How far are we willing to go? And perhaps the most important question of all, are we ready to make the sacrifices necessary to create the world we claim to want? In the end, Bill Maher and Harrison Ford hadn't just clashed. They'd opened up a dialogue, one that would linger long after the show ended. The world may not have been ready to change, but at least the conversation had begun.